Cool. All right. Welcome back to another episode of Firewall. As usual, I'm your host, Bradley Tusk. With me today is someone that I think I've spent, I would say, a decent amount of time with in the last couple of years and gotten to know and have been on his podcast a couple of times, and he's been on mine once. Scott Galloway, thank you for joining us.
Good to see you, Brad. What's going on?
So we've got you down in your now studio in Florida, and instead of commuting, you're now there pretty much full time. How has that been?
Well, you don't like to say this out loud because you're cognizant of the suffering out there, but if you're in call it the top 10%, much less the top 1%, you likely are spending less time commuting. So all of a sudden you have 5 to 10 hours. In my case, I probably have 10 to 15 hours a week freed up. I used to commute to New York every week. Go outside and there's fewer emissions in Florida. I don't think the water's ever been this clean or the air this clear. And if you're like me and invested in big tech, you're wealthier than you've ever been. So it's great to be, doing well going into COVID means you're doing great now. Doing poorly going to COVID means you're doing terribly. So if you're fortunate enough not to have a loved one who's been impacted by, the novel coronavirus, the reality is we've gone from what I would call economic dysfunction to economic dystopia. And if you're on the right side of that, things have never been better and you feel bad about it. But yeah, my life, I go boogie boarding with my kids a couple times a week. I never used to do that in the afternoons. And I've set up my operation, and what I do and what you do, we can do remotely. There's some face-to-face, but we've seen that, 60, 80, 90% of it can be done remotely.
Yeah, for sure. We've been investing out of the fund. Like I mentioned, raised this SPAC yesterday, raising a new fund. It all seems to work just fine.
Yeah.
On Zoom. So, normally you split your time between New York and Florida. I'm going to run a thesis that I have by you around New York and then cities in general, which is second half of the 20th century, manufacturers started to realize, you know what? We can make things with just about the same quality somewhere a lot cheaper. Initially went from kind of Northeast down to the South in the U.S. and then ultimately ended up in Asia and parts all over the world. And I feel like COVID may have been that same aha moment on office space. So New York especially, but I think this is also true of a lot of the kind of major first-tier U.S. cities, has always been a white-collar hub, right? We're the physical home of finance and law and media and marketing and advertising and fashion and kind of go down the list. That's ultimately a lot of jobs, a lot of people. And so even when New York had hard times before, the 70s, the early 90s, after 9/11, the city wasn't necessarily doing well, but the economic base was still always there, right? These jobs were still there. And my great fear is that now after people have spent 6-7 months running their businesses just fine, like you said, on Zoom, and they've had that kind of equivalent realization the manufacturers had, which is, I don't have to be in New York, but I don't have to be anywhere. Right? I could literally just be virtual if I want and occasionally convene people when it's safe. And some percentage, 10%, 20%, 30% of jobs are just not going to come back to New York City. And maybe, LA and Chicago and some other cities have the same, San Francisco, same problem. And that effectively does to those cities what the decline of manufacturing did to a Baltimore, a Cleveland, a Detroit, where the tax base collapses from within and they don't necessarily recover. Is that a risk that you would worry about?
I think, look, there's so much in there, and it's situational. And I spoke to a guy in Richard, Florida, who's going to forget more about cities than I'm ever going to know. But if you look at economic history, the biggest cities actually usually do pretty well post-pandemic. So historically, they usually recover pretty well. But you look at some of the structural trends you're talking about, and that is, all right, the building, my first job at Morgan Stanley was at 1251 out in the Americas. They average 8,500 people in the building during work hours. They're averaging 500 right now. And even if that comes back, it's not coming back to 8,500. And then tax base, and when you have the wealthiest people, so I would say a third of the people I know who have a certain net worth over a certain amount have contacted me in the last 90 days and started asking questions about Florida schools, Florida real estate. One guy I work with who runs a very successful hedge fund called me and has moved down here in about 60 days with his family. And it's happening everywhere. And I'm not exaggerating. It might even be 50% of the people I know that make, call it, really good livings. because they do the math and they were planning to move down. COVID is more of an accelerant than it is a change agent. It wasn't they weren't planning to move down here. They were thinking, oh, I'll move to Miami, I'll move to Palm Beach, I'll move to Florida at some point in the future. The future's now. Everyone's like, if I was planning to do it in 3 to 10 years from now, I'm doing it in 3 to 10 weeks.
Yeah.
And then you think about what happens to the tax base in these high tax, cold states. It could be a downward spiral. And the thing, when people ask, how do you think New York, Manhattan's going to do? I think, okay, there's no getting around it. The debt holders on commercial real estate or retail space it's going to be a bloodbath. In terms of the health of the city, I think a lot of it is contingent on quality of life, specifically around crime.
Yeah.
And that is, you could see a future where, all right, rent goes down 30%. A lot of those office buildings get converted to apartments. It puts pressure on rents. There's a lot of debt holders take back the properties. Rents come down 20, 30, 50%. The cost of living comes down. Older people decide they don't want to be in the city where there's health risks. And New York goes back to the cost structure of the 80s or 90s, but ideally without the crime. When I moved to New York in the late 80s and early 90s, it was much less expensive, but there was a lot more crime, so there was a trade-off. So there is a scenario where it becomes not affordable, but more affordable, because the reality is, unless you're making kind of 7 figures plus in Manhattan, you can't really live here and have kids, or live there and have kids, and not be one of these people that dances between the raindrops. Some people figure it out, but it's become obnoxiously expensive. So you can see a scenario where it might be a great place that's younger and less expensive. You can also see a place where if crime continues, and I don't know if it's accelerating, I've seen conflicting data, but if crime goes up and it becomes unsafe. There was a couple times during COVID-19 where I was walking around Manhattan and I thought, this is the first time in 20 or 25 years where I've been in an unhealthy way conscious of my surroundings because it feels dangerous.
Yeah.
And I hadn't felt that way in any part of Manhattan or 20 or 30 years. But some of the statistics say that some aspects of crime are increasing, others are not. So I think we're at a crossroads here. And I think a lot of it is dependent upon crime and the perception of crime in the city. And you can see it becoming a downward spiral, or you could see a new golden age of the city where a 30-year-old making $100,000 a year as opposed to $500,000 can have a nice life in New York. So I know, what are your thoughts? I have been wrong on this. I thought the suburbs were going to take a hit. I thought you either want to live in the city or you want to live in a beautiful leafy neighborhood in Wisconsin. And actually, it's the suburbs that have boomed. So I'm curious, what is your thesis?
I think there's so I think it's a real problem because for, all of your friends who move to Florida and don't go back to the Morgan Stanley building, it's also then so many other jobs that exist to support
wealth work,
right?
The support,
right. So like that, all the trickle down effect is terrible. On crime, this is my greatest concern, which is right now we have 2 different movements happening in New York at the same time, and this is true nationally. One is around, and they're both valid, right? So one's around social justice and police reform, and the people making those points, I think, are absolutely right in a lot of what they're saying, right? And then the other is cities, in order to function, have to be safe. When they're not safe, everything else falls apart.
Yep.
It is the bedrock of everything else. And there is some relationship between defunding the police or not and how much crime there is or not, right? So, for example, the Democratic Socialists of America announced their platform for the city council races next year. And among their items was cutting NYPD funding in half from $6 billion to $3 billion. It seems impossible to me to not have a significant correlation of an increase in crime if you cut the NYPD in half, because if you cut it from $6 billion to $3 billion, you're firing like 20,000 cops, right? So, my concern is, depending on who we elect as the next mayor, if they are not capable of navigating this issue, and I think there's almost a risk in a way that kind of any white guy who's on the left will kind of automatically run into the same problem de Blasio has, where the Black Lives movement, they hate de Blasio, and so does the NYPD, and so does the police union. So I'm really worried that it's not politically a solvable problem, and that even if crime can be contained, Manhattan is dirtier, the number of homeless are up, the number of graffiti, that all, when you get to that question of do post-vaccine, do 90% of office jobs return or 70%? Quality of life has a lot to do with that differential. And the worse it gets. And the city and the state combined are looking at a $50 billion budget deficit over the next 2 years. And we have a completely incompetent mayor right now. And, candidates for mayor who are better than de Blasio, but they're politicians, they're career politicians. And so if you look 6 months to 2.5 years into the future for New York, I think it's pretty concerning.
Yeah, and I mean, so there's so much to unpack there. I worry a little bit that the crisis won't be deep enough to create the structural reform we need, and that is in an 11-year bull market when you have special interest groups who can shut down the subway or strike in sanitation. It's easier just to kind of pay, and we ignore the fact that to build a mile of subway in Manhattan costs 11 times what it costs to build it in another city.
Right.
And no mayor wants to be the person that, while on his watch, and I say his watch because I can't think of the last time we had a female mayor, but if ever, have we ever had a female mayor in New York City? Okay, so no guy on his watch wants to be the guy where the New York subway shuts down and goes on strike. So it's just easier to make these incremental pay increases, and we've ended up, like a lot of businesses right now, with an unsustainable cost structure that as long as we're in an unprecedented bull market, we're fine. And there's just no getting around it. We're going to have to cut costs. And the question is, who registers? Manhattan is going to lose a lot of economic vitality. The key is, who's going to register those losses? Is it the debt holders on buildings and commercial and retail and all those new condos are popping up? I think of WeWork. The people who registered the majority of the losses were SoftBank, PIF, and WeWork employees. But it wasn't registered by the public markets because the thing got the fire door went closed before it went public. So who registers the losses here? And is it going to be our unions and some of the cost structure going to have to bring down their costs here? Or are they just going to say, no, we're out, subways get stopped, the trash piles up, crime piles up, and the remaining tax base literally runs for the doors. They just aren't willing to stick around and see if it gets any better. Or is there a way to, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Is there a way to right-size our cost structure and either reduce it or stop the increases, figure out a way to attract more businesses? Facebook, there are signs. Facebook and Google are both, and Amazon are all hiring like crazy and expanding their footprint in the city. Young people, it comes that the one thing New York has going for it, when I look at my life over the last 30 years, I've basically spent a decent amount of my life on a plane the last 30 years. I was a strategy consultant. Then I was a data guy. I saw a list of the quote unquote the 20 best cities in the world. And I think 18 of them I had spent at least 60 days in. So I feel as if I know almost every city fairly well, whether it's Sydney, whether it's Seoul, whether it's, Milan. Everyone is competing for number two. And New York is singular. It is number one. The density of creativity, grit, culture creates this magic that when you're a young person and you're making some money, you just want to be here. Even if you don't like cities, you want to be here for a couple of years. So I think that the thing we have going for us is the bottom line is, if you like cities, we're number one. Full stop. The question is, will that singularity, if you will there be enough organizations and companies that come here to take advantage, hopefully, of a declining costs or some declining costs, and bring enough young people such that the city sheds some skin, rejuvenates, reflates? Or do we just enter into a downward spiral, an inexorable downward spiral? And you go to mayoral candidates. I want a mayoral candidate that's willing to be sober and honest and get everyone in a room and say, you got to cut costs. We got to cut services. X, Y, and Z. Facebook, we can't give you subsidies. Amazon, we can't give you subsidies. And tries to lead. It's going to be an almost impossible tax. Just as I think California has literally become ungovernable. I think there's just so many special interest groups who don't look at the long-term health of the state. So you want to talk about city? I think San Francisco, you want to talk about a city that's fucked. I think San Francisco has literally become dystopic, whether it's whether it's unbreathable air, homeless, terrible quality of life. It's like incredibly poor quality of life, but expensive. That's an algorithm that nobody wants to engage in, or a calculus they need to want to engage in if all of a sudden they can work from somewhere else. So San Francisco, I think San Francisco has like already been kicked in the nuts and is still on its knees, and it's about to go flat on its back. Whereas I think New York is at a crossroads. I don't know if the story has been written. I can see a scenario where in 5 or 10 years, New York is a place that's not only still singular and wonderful, but is a more affordable, accessible place for a new generation of information worker.
Right. You could have, so for example, one thing we've never had in New York is our own homegrown Amazon, Google, Apple, in part because it's just too expensive to start here, right? It's really hard to do. With all of the vacant real estate that we're going to have, arguably a really proactive mayor could say, hey, I'm going to make this almost free for startups and try to seed as many as I possibly can so that one of them hits and ultimately creates 200,000 jobs in the city. Clearly, as prices come down, creative people will come back into Manhattan and there will be kind of an artistic, renaissance. However, one of the best artistic periods in New York City's history was the late 70s, right? It produced some of the best bands that were in New York and some of the best movies. Didn't really do much to change the economy at that point, but it produced a lot of great art. So, I think you're right that we're at that moment. Look, you're going to have a mayor, and this is true everywhere around the U.S., not just New York, that says if we continue to meet all of our commitments to our retirees, to people collecting pensions, we will have to dramatically slash everything for everyone else, right? Hospitals, schools, subways. And at some point, even though it's politically difficult, someone's going to have to say, sorry, I know that you were promised an 8% return every year, but it's just not going to happen, right? And your benefits are going to be less than you expected them to be. But I don't see anyone running for mayor right now.
I don't see that leadership right now. I don't see anyone willing to has the backbone to say that right now, because they probably won't get elected if they say that. What I could see is a pivot to the right and another quality of life Giuliani-like mayor, because look, if you're spending $7 million on a condo in Tribeca and you got some guy urinating on your front step, you don't care about. All you care about is who's going to come in and offer you quality of life. And I think we could easily get to that point. The people I see running for mayor will pander, will tell everyone we can keep taxes, not raise taxes, but keep our current cost infrastructure, which is just untenable. It's just not going to happen. So I feel like I'm looking for the first person that has an honest, open, sober conversation with the voting populace. But unfortunately, the voting populace has been trained to think, oh, wait, we're not the federal government. We can't print money, right? The city has to balance its budget, or at least that's my understanding, which makes it almost untenable.
At least on paper is supposed to, yeah.
On paper, that's right. Who do you like? I'm curious, Brad. You're very politically astute. Who do you think's going to win, and who are you supporting?
So I haven't decided who to support yet. There were 3 frontrunners in the race. Scott Stringer is the city controller, Eric Adams, the Brooklyn Borough president, and Corey Johnson, who is the city council speaker. I was closest of those 3 with Corey. Corey decided last week not to run. He's had some mental health issues recently and felt like that was more important than running for office, which I think was admirable. So right now you've got Stringer and Adams very much in the pole position. The good news is they're both a lot better than de Blasio. The question
pretty low bar, boss. That's a pretty low bar.
Correct.
I mean, come on. He's going to go down as one of the worst mayors in recent history.
Well, definitely the worst mayor in recent history. The question, would he go down as the worst mayor in all of New York history? And that goes back to the 1600s. And the answer is possibly yes. So there are a bunch of kind of second-tier candidates. I don't think any of them at the moment have what it takes to break through.
What about Andrew Yang? What if Andrew Yang said it?
So that's the third category would be, does someone really famous step in and run? Yang's people insist he's not running. And I think the reason why he's not going to run was based at least on a conversation that I had with them, which is Yang wants to be president, right? He's been very clear about that.
Yep.
Not only has no New York City mayor ever become president, no New York City mayor has ever become governor or senator. It is a great job, but it is literally the ultimate dead-end job in American politics.
That's really interesting.
I think if you're young and ambitious, like Yang is, or Hakeem Jeffries or someone like that, you're not going to do it. It has to be someone almost at the end of their career, like a Hillary Clinton deciding she wants to be mayor or something like that. Maybe she's past the point.
I don't know, a Jamie Dimon or
yeah, but he can't win because he may be talented. Mike won. We won in 01 because of 9/11, right? Absent 9/11, we lose by 25 points. Yeah, ran a good campaign. Yes, our opponent Mark Green was a total schmuck. 10 things went right, but all of that was predicated on 9/11, which was just a black swan event. So without that, the turnout is so low, both in the primary and the general, that someone coming from finance, at least right now, can't win. In 4 years, if things have gotten materially worse and that person in Tribeca chooses to turn out and vote in the Democratic primary, sure. But right now, that person isn't voting. We had 400,000 votes cast in the Democratic primary in 2017 here in a city of 8.6 million people.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so for as long as turnout is that low, now maybe my mobile voting thing at some point, happens in large scale and we can vote that way. But right now, a Jamie Dimon is just not electable, even if he'd be good at the job. Speaking of black swan events, what's your take on Trump and COVID? Trump having COVID, I guess.
My first reaction, I read it about 1 a.m. last night. I was up and I immediately tweeted thoughts and prayers. First off, I don't think you can trust anything the White House says. I immediately thought, are they lying? Is this an attempt to say, I've got COVID, I'm handing over the presidency to Mike Pence in an abundance of caution, and then Mike Pence says the president is not healthy, and just I'm pardoning him. I don't trust or believe anything they say. Now, having said that, I went through the calculus and thought, okay, what advantage would they have by saying it? He has been reckless and negligent, and with the core morbidities really of COVID-19 are arrogance and optimism. Most crises we can solve with optimism. You go out and you spend more money on a Hyundai, it takes us out of a recession. You believe that we can turn back Hitler, and you show up to the factory and you start building armaments. Optimism can solve crises. Optimism is a bug, not a feature with COVID-19, because you're under the impression that the virus is going to get the memo regarding your desire to get back to some sense of normalcy. And I think that nowhere is that more prevalent with the president's behavior, thinking that he doesn't need a mask, thinking that this thing could magically disappear or that he could wash it away with bleach. So I just find the whole thing so incredibly discouraging. And I thought, okay, the Biden campaign can't be happy about this because they were tracking towards a win, and they just don't want any exogenous events. They're like, the landing lights are on. We don't know what this is going to do or how it's going to play out. So they're like, okay, what does this mean? But if you look at the other world leader, Boris Johnson, he's become less popular after people didn't have initially he got a sympathy bump, and then people are like, boss, you didn't take this seriously. You took a stupid risk. You didn't take it seriously. You paid the price, and the country. You're a small metaphor for what's happened with this country under your leadership. So, I don't know how exactly to react to this. I just don't. I'm so, that debate. First off, I'm just fucking exhausted with Trump. Distinct to the politics. Michael Bennet had what I thought was the best line that resonated with me during the presidential campaign. He said, "If you elect me, you won't have to think about me, because I'll handle North Korea. I'll make sure I'll cover pre-existing conditions, and you just won't have to think about me." And I find I am thinking about Trump every goddamn day, and I am just sick of it. I don't want to think about anyone this much. That shit show dumpster fire that was the debate, I found physically rattling. I actually had to turn it off at one point. I found it so disturbing and upsetting. And then at 1 a.m., I'm about to go to sleep, and okay, he and his wife have COVID-19. I'm just exhausted by this guy. So I don't know what it means. My initial thinking is they're lying and they have some other plan, because this is not someone who can be trusted. This is not someone above lying about our most serious issues. But I did the math, and I'm like, I don't see a lot of advantage to saying you have this. And you don't want to wish ill on anyone, but I also don't want him to have the ability to say, see, it was no big deal. We should all be opening. We should all be, I worry that he's going to come out and say, yeah, I got a fever, but let's be honest, this has been overblown by the far left and we should be opening schools everywhere. In Florida, on the day we had more deaths than any state in the union, the governor decided to totally reopen that day. I'm like, when did we become this stupid? So I have a lot of mixed emotions around this. I'm still kind of processing. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, same thing in that, it's hard to figure out the electoral advantage for saying you have COVID if you don't have it, right? I guess there's this thesis that because Democrats are sort of often naturally soft, maybe they say, oh, now we can't go after Trump and attack him because he's sympathetic because of COVID. They take their foot off his neck. I have to believe that Team Biden is not that stupid.
Yeah, I don't think so.
And they'll keep their foot on the gas. And so the other thing would just be, are you setting yourself up for, the excuses for why you didn't win? Like you said, possibly a pardon from Pence or anything else like that. So it felt like if it were a lie, it was more around post-electoral issues than the election itself. Or more likely, he just has COVID because he's stuck and he doesn't wear a mask, and that's what happens. Why do you think his administration picked Google as the first major target for antitrust prosecution?
Because I think they've done the most work on it. Also, my thesis is that Barr. So first off, the people at the DOJ working on it, a lot of them resigned because they said, we're not ready. And when you're facing an army of hundreds of lawyers from the deepest pocket in the private world, Google, have been preparing and lining up their tanks and troops at the border waiting for this. If we don't go in with our aim is true and our guns locked and loaded, we're going to lose. And so I think they were smart to focus in on search. But I think this is not. I'm worried it's an October surprise, and that is they announce this, and then behind the scenes, Barr goes to Pichai and his board and says, "You're never going to get the deal I'm about to offer you." Because let's be honest, with 93% share of a $150 billion category called search and dramatic anti-competitive abuse for the last decade because you had this unholy alliance with Obama, just as Facebook has an unholy alliance with us. Let's be clear, you don't have a leg to stand on. If you agree to X, Y, and Z, I'll give you what is the equivalent of a speeding ticket when you should be put away for 20 years. And they're going to announce a deal and a settlement before the election so they can chalk up a victory to say, see what a gangster I am, see how good I am, I broke up Google. They spin the cloud, they agree to spin the cloud, or they agree to spin YouTube, or they agree to pay some monstrous fine. I worry that this isn't a thoughtful, measured approach to antitrust. They're just saying we're going after Google, and Barr is calling the board and saying, similar to what a lot of prosecutors are saying the deal's only going to get worse from here. And that they might announce a deal with Google before the election so they can have a series of victories before the election.
Yeah. Assuming that doesn't happen, and let's say Biden wins, do they stay on the Google prosecution, or do they think about shifting over to Facebook or someone else? It didn't strike me that Google was the easiest target of the four to take on politically.
I think the answer is yes. I think a Biden administration, especially if Warren is anywhere, especially if Warren's in the cabinet, I think there's too many forces on both sides lining up against big tech. I wrote an article that was in Esquire about the dangers of big tech, and the first two elected officials I heard from were people in Senators Warren and Cruz's office. And I thought when those two people call you on the same day, you're onto something. And while they're both angry at big tech for different reasons, the reality is they're both angry. And I think there's so much momentum that you're going to see antitrust across all of them, with the exception of Apple. And I think Apple will be more about regulating the App Store. It may take longer than we think. If it doesn't happen at a federal level, it's going to happen at a state level. All 50 states have signed up for a coalition around antitrust. So if the feds can't get big tobacco, the states will. It's the same thing's going to happen here. I think I've had my heart broken before. I can't believe we're still talking about this shit. But it strikes me that it's going to happen. That their only get out of jail card would be if they did a deal early with Trump. He gets reelected. He doesn't have the same mojo or understanding or the discipline or, quite frankly, just the competence They can't get a health care plan out, much less they have emasculated the DOJ and the FTC, budget cut after budget cut after budget cut. And that's the fear, is the government has become overrun. And one of the key steps to tyranny is that when government no longer becomes a countervailing force to private power, it becomes a co-conspirator. And we're at that point. When a company has 93% share, and not even anything about economic terms, if I type in how to overthrow my government into Google, they get to decide whether the first search return is how to build a dirty bomb or a voter registration form. And they won't release, and we have no idea, we have no visibility into how they determine the algorithms that decide how to nudge people one way or the other. That's just too much power. It's dangerous. And I'm not saying they're bad people, but good people, dictators and the people who start horrible actions, don't wake up and say, I'm going to be a bad person. It's an incremental series of bad decisions made by people with too much power. So I'm hopeful. I've been heartbroken before. I don't see how we don't end up in some sort of antitrust action against all of them, with the exception of Apple. I think Apple skirts away with just regulation on the App Store because they've done a fantastic job, and you're the master of this, of disarticulating themselves from the rest of big tech and starching their hat white by doubling down on privacy, which I think was probably the genius communications move of the last decade.
Yeah, every time they say no to the Department of Homeland Security or the FBI, perception. Well, I'll close and give you one reason for optimism, which is, so if Biden wins and if the Senate flips as well, I do think you'll see privacy federal legislation happen next year, some U.S. version of GDPR. I think you could see some legislative attempts to deal with Section 230, deal with antitrust, probably deal with work classification. I think simply because if you look at the political incentives, you have people with a lot of power and a lot of energy like AOC or Warren who hate big tech and hate tech in general. And if you're Biden or Schumer or Pelosi and a lot of this stuff, it's like, all right, this is what's going to keep you busy and make you happy, knock yourself out. We're going to take care of the stuff that we care about, right? They're not mutually exclusive with each other. And Schumer also is worried about being primaried by AOC in 2022.
Do you think that happens? Do you think she primaries him?
I saw some data last night that was pretty good for Chuck. However, I think she is just too ambitious and moving too fast and everything else to be willing to stay in place. And she's a risk taker. And I think she will. And while I would bet on Chuck, I wouldn't guarantee it by any means. But one way that Chuck will try to either stop her from running or hurt her ability to be effective against him is by taking every single kind of left-wing thing the House passes and just pushing it right through the Senate. And if that means getting rid of the filibuster rule or whatever else, so be it. So to me, if you accept that all as the political reality paves the way for a lot of left-leaning legislation, then I think some of the concerns around big tech actually will get addressed in the next couple of years.
And I know it's your podcast, but I can't resist asking you questions. Handicap the presidential race here and now and the odds that the Democrats retake the Senate.
Yeah, I mean, the odds are pretty good, right? I mean, statistically speaking right now, even if you assume that there is some sort of hidden Trump voting block that doesn't show up in the polls like that happened 4 years ago. So the undecideds aren't really undecided. They're Trump voters, right, in this particular case. It still takes Biden's lead down to, depending on the poll, 4 to 6, right? 4 to 6 is enough that even with the structural disadvantage in the Electoral College, you're still winning pretty easily. So now, could there be other October surprises? An election is a month from tomorrow. Yeah, that could absolutely happen. But assuming that's not the case, I think Biden wins. Now, there may not be a peaceful transition of power. Trump might try to get the Supreme Court to overturn it in some way, although I suspect John Roberts hates Trump just as much as everyone else does, so he's not going to want to do that. And the math would say that Democrats will pick up seats in a whole bunch of states, whether it's Arizona, or North Carolina, or Iowa, or Colorado, or Montana, or Maine. So, yeah, I do think it'll all flip.
What do you think happens in South Carolina?
I think Graham ultimately wins. It would be great if he didn't.
And Kentucky?
Same thing.
I agree.
All these places that are all going to turn purple kind of never really do. Texas, same thing. You know, Like Beto O'Rourke ran the campaign of a lifetime. Ted Cruz, like the most
Agreed.
elite politician in the country. He's
Yeah.
still alive, right?
Yeah,
So, from math standpoint, it doesn't really matter, right? Obviously, you'd love to not see Lindsey Graham in the Senate, but if all of a sudden, if Biden has won and the Senate flips, and by the way, I'm an independent. I hate both parties kind of equally. I think they're all scumbags, corrupt. And yet still, I want to see this happen. So I do think so, but I definitely worry a lot about, is there a peaceful transition of power? And maybe the whole Cobra thing is actually set up in a way to create excuses for losing, to then, in a weird way, make it easier for him to go. And if he somehow is given the seat for 4 more years, I think you're going to see a lot of violence. I think the violence you saw during the George Floyd protests are going to be nothing compared to what's going to happen.
Yeah, it really feels as if all bets are off. It's just going to be 4 years of more agita and just chaos. It's just chaos.
Yeah, it's stressful. I usually do not get stressed about things that I can't control, and I'm genuinely stressed out about all of this because I keep thinking about it all the time. So, on that very optimistic, happy note, I'll wrap us up. So, Scott, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bradley. Best to you and yours.
Same.